Imagine this. You're living in the 1920s, deep in the heart of Oklahoma. You wake up to see rows of black oil derricks rising like steel giants across the plains. The land that once seemed empty and forgotten is now gushing with rivers of crude oil. And at the center of this wealth? The Osage Nation. For a brief moment in history, the Osage people were the richest people per capita in the entire world. Mansions, chauffeurs, fine clothes, jewels. It was a life few Americans could even dream of during the Roaring Twenties. But here's the dark twist. The richer they became, the faster they began to die. One by one, Osage men and women fell to mysterious illnesses, sudden shootings, and unexplained explosions. Neighbors whispered, families wept, and the rest of America barely paid attention until the death toll grew too high to ignore. What was happening in Osage County was not just greed. It was not just jealousy. It was something far darker, a conspiracy that would expose the rotten core of American power. This is the story of the Osage murders, the story behind killers of the Flower Moon. The story begins long before the first bullet was fired. To understand the tragedy, we need to understand the people it targeted. The Osage Nation had once lived across vast stretches of the Midwest. But like so many indigenous nations, they were forced from their lands again and again, pushed westward by treaties that were broken almost as soon as the ink dried. Finally, in the late 1800s, they settled in northeastern Oklahoma. To outsiders, the land seemed barren, rocky, dry, and unforgiving. The U.S. government likely thought they had given the Osage a useless plot of earth, just another way to get them out of sight, out of mind. But beneath that harsh soil was one of the richest oil deposits in the United States. By the 1920s, oil derricks dotted the horizon like monuments to fortune. The Osage owned the mineral rights to their land, and with every barrel pumped, they grew wealthier. They didn't just earn money, they earned millions. And here's what's important. This wealth was not hidden. Newspapers across the country marveled at the Osage lifestyle. They wrote scandalous headlines about red millionaires, mocking the fact that indigenous families now had chauffeurs, sent their children to Europe for schooling, and wore diamond rings as casually as others wore buttons. Imagine the jealousy this sparked. In an America still deeply racist, still locked in old hierarchies of power, many white neighbors saw this wealth not as earned, but as undeserved. And this resentment was not silent. People said it openly. How could Native people be richer than white people? But the Osage didn't just have wealth. They had something far more dangerous: independence. And that, perhaps, is what truly threatened those who surrounded them. Here's where the story gets even more twisted. Each member of the Osage Nation owned a headright. Think of it like a permanent share in the oil profits of the tribe. These headrights could not be sold, only inherited, which meant, as long as oil flowed, the Osage people and their heirs would remain wealthy. But what happens when someone wants your headright, and the only way they can get it is if you're dead? Already, the system was being undermined. Courts appointed white guardians to manage the wealth of Osage people, often claiming they weren't competent enough to handle their own money. These guardians controlled purchases, bank accounts, even daily expenses. Corruption was rampant. Guardians skimmed money, overcharged for goods, or simply stole outright. But for some men, even theft wasn't enough. They wanted everything. And soon, they would find a way to take it. Picture Fairfax, Oklahoma, around 1921. The town is small, dusty, framed by prairie grass and the ever-present smell of oil. The streets are a mix of Model T Fords and horse-drawn wagons. On one side, you'll see Osage families living in grand houses with marble floors, phonographs, and silk curtains. On the other, white settlers struggling just to make ends meet. To some, it looked like progress. To others, it looked like a threat to the very order of things. And right in the middle of this rising tension, the killings began. At first, the deaths seemed isolated. A woman found poisoned. A man shot on a lonely road. An explosion that tore through a house in the middle of the night. But soon, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The Osage were not dying by chance. They were being hunted. And behind the veil of small-town smiles and polite Sunday church services, a conspiracy was growing. A conspiracy that would soon shake America to its core. The year is 1921. The Osage Nation is at the height of its oil wealth. But beneath the surface of luxury cars and sprawling ranches, danger lurks. It started quietly. At first, you could almost mistake it for coincidence. A young Osage woman named Anna Brown was found dead in a ravine. She had been missing for days before her body turned up, discarded like refuse in the Oklahoma dust. She was only in her 30s. The authorities claimed she had been drinking. Probably just passed out, they said. Fell down and hit her head. But Anna's family didn't believe it. Especially her sister, Molly Burkhart. Molly loved Anna. She knew her better than anyone, and she knew her sister had been murdered. Within months, more Osage deaths followed. Another of Molly's sisters, Minnie, wasted away under strange circumstances. The doctor called it a wasting illness, but neighbors whispered about poison. Then, in 1923, Molly's other sister, Rita, and her husband were blown to pieces when their house exploded in the middle of the night. The fireball lit up the prairie sky, visible for miles. Rita's body was found in the ashes, her bones charred black. 3 sisters, all dead. And each time, the explanations were weak, the investigations sloppy, the silence deafening. But it wasn't just Molly's family. Dozens of Osage men and women, wealthy headright holders, were dying under suspicious circumstances. Shot in the head, found poisoned, bodies dumped on roadsides. And every time, the killers seemed to vanish into thin air. Now ask yourself this: how could so many murders take place in one community without justice? The truth is, many in Osage County didn't want justice. Local sheriffs looked the other way. Doctors wrote death certificates blaming natural causes. Undertakers buried bodies without question. Coroners turned blind eyes. It was as if the entire system was rigged to bury the truth right alongside the victims. Why? Because in many cases, the murderers weren't strangers lurking in the shadows. They were neighbors, friends, business partners, even spouses. And as each Osage headright holder died, their wealth didn't vanish, it transferred. To guardians, to white-in-laws, to men who smiled in public while plotting in secret. At the center of this storm was a man named William Hale. To the world, Hale was a respected cattleman. He dressed neatly, spoke politely, and attended church every Sunday. People called him King of the Osage Hills. He gave to charities, played the part of a generous benefactor, and pretended to be a friend to the Osage. But behind closed doors, Hale was something else entirely. He was a wolf in human clothing. He had carefully inserted himself into Osage families through marriages and business ties. One of his nephews, Ernest Burkhart, was married to none other than Molly, whose sisters were being killed, one by one. Think about that for a second. Molly's sisters were dying mysterious deaths, while her husband and his powerful uncle stood to benefit from every single tragedy. Coincidence? Or something far more sinister? By now, Molly was living in fear. She had lost 3 sisters. Her mother, Lizzie, was growing frail and soon passed away. Some suspected poison once again. Molly herself began falling ill. She felt weak, tired, sick. Was it stress? Or was someone slowly poisoning her too? Imagine what it felt like to live in her shoes. To sit at the dinner table with your husband, never fully sure if the food on your plate was safe. To lie awake at night listening for footsteps, wondering if your house would be the next to explode. And yet, Molly stayed silent for as long as she could. Why? Because the killers weren't strangers, they were family. By 1925, the Osage murders had become an open secret. Some estimates suggest as many as 24 Osage people were killed during this reign of terror, though the true number may be far higher. The community was paralyzed. Who could they trust? Local law enforcement was corrupt. Judges were corrupt. Guardians were corrupt. Even some clergy turned their heads. The killers had created a climate of fear so suffocating that many Osage simply gave up hope of ever finding justice. But Molly refused to give up. She went outside the county, beyond the state, beyond the local lawmen who were bought and paid for. She appealed directly to the federal government. And what happened next would mark the beginning of one of the FBI's earliest and most dangerous investigations. The Osage murders were no longer a local problem. They had become a national scandal. For the first time, J. Edgar Hoover's fledgling Bureau of Investigation would be put to the test. Could this young, unproven agency uncover the truth behind the conspiracy? Or would the killers remain untouchable in the hills of Oklahoma? What the agents discovered shocked even the most hardened investigators. And the truth was darker than anyone imagined. The Bureau of Investigation, what would one day become the FBI, was still young in the 1920s. It wasn't the powerful agency we picture today. In fact, it was struggling to prove its worth. And for J. Edgar Hoover, the newly appointed director, the Osage case was the perfect opportunity. Hoover was obsessed with order, discipline, and the image of professionalism. He wanted to transform the Bureau from a loose collection of agents into a modern law enforcement powerhouse. And what better way to do that than by solving a high-profile case the local authorities had failed to crack? So he sent in a team. Leading the investigation was Tom White, a former Texas Ranger. White wasn't flashy. He wasn't a man of politics. He was steady, methodical, and unshakably honest. Hoover trusted him to get results without bringing embarrassment to the Bureau. White handpicked a small team of undercover agents. Some posed as cattlemen, others as oil workers. They blended into the Oklahoma landscape, watching, listening, slowly piecing together the truth. And what they found was terrifying. All trails led back to one man, William Hale. On the surface, Hale was still the generous cattle king, always ready with a handshake and a kind word. But as the agents dug deeper, they uncovered a chilling pattern. Hale had orchestrated marriages between his nephews and wealthy Osage women. He had positioned himself as a trusted advisor. He had worked his way into wills, estates, and insurance policies. And then those same women, those same families, were slaughtered, one by one. Anna Brown, Rita and Bill Smith in the house explosion, Molly's mother, others poisoned, shot, or disappeared, and who stood to inherit their wealth. Hale's family. It was a scheme so cold, so calculated, that it stunned even seasoned lawmen. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part of the story is Molly's husband, Ernest Burkhart. At first glance, Ernest seemed like a simple man caught between two worlds. He professed love for Molly, cared for their children, and lived under the shadow of his powerful uncle. But as the investigation dug deeper, it became clear. Ernest was not innocent. He was a pawn, yes, but a willing pawn. He knew what was happening to Molly's family. He may have even participated in planning some of the killings. And while his wife grew sicker and weaker, Ernest stayed silent. Imagine the betrayal. The man who shared Molly's bed, the man who fathered her children, may have been complicit in the murders of her sisters. The agents had uncovered a conspiracy that wasn't just about money. It was about trust twisted into a weapon. Love poisoned by greed. But even with evidence piling up, the Bureau faced enormous challenges. Witnesses were terrified. Some vanished before they could testify. Others were bribed into silence. Still others were murdered themselves. Local juries were reluctant to convict white men for the murders of Native people. Every time progress was made, it seemed like someone pulled the strings to stop it. But Tom White and his team pressed on. They documented testimonies. They followed money trails. They traced inheritance records. Slowly, they built a case that was impossible to ignore. The turning point came when one of the conspirators broke. Under pressure, he confessed that William Hale had been the mastermind all along. Hale had ordered the murders. Hale had arranged the bombings. Hale had poisoned, bribed, and manipulated his way into Osage wealth. And Ernest? He too began to crack. Confronted with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of losing everything, he admitted to his role in the crimes. His betrayal of Molly was complete. Not only had he stood by as her family was killed, he had been part of the machine that destroyed them. The conspiracy was laid bare. The wolves had shown their teeth. But justice was still uncertain. Would the courts of Oklahoma convict men like William Hale, who had money, power, and influence? Or would the Osage murders be buried under the same corruption that allowed them to happen in the first place? As the trials began, the entire nation held its breath. And for the Osage, the outcome would determine not just the fate of a few killers, but whether America itself could ever deliver justice to its first peoples. The investigation had exposed the conspiracy. The Bureau had traced the murders back to William Hale and his circle. But exposing the truth was only half the battle. Now came the trials. And in Oklahoma in the 1920s, a courtroom was not always a place of justice. It was a theater, a battlefield, a place where money and influence often outweighed evidence and truth. When William Hale was finally arrested, the town buzzed with disbelief. How could the king of the Osage Hills be accused of such horrors? Hale had spent years building a reputation as a benefactor, a man of generosity. He had donated to churches, helped neighbors, and played the role of a civic leader. But behind the polished smile, the evidence was undeniable. Hale had bribed, threatened, and murdered his way toward the Osage oil fortune. Still, Hale was confident. He had money. He had lawyers. He had influence in the community. And he believed that no jury of white men would convict him for killing Native people. The most gut-wrenching testimony came from Ernest Burkhart. At first, Ernest resisted turning against his uncle. He was torn between loyalty to Hale and the weight of what he had done to his own wife. But as investigators pressed, Ernest began to crack. In a trembling voice, he admitted to his role. He confirmed that Hale had masterminded the plot, that the murders of Molly's sisters, her mother, and others had been orchestrated for one reason: to inherit their oil head rights. For Molly, sitting in that courtroom, the betrayal was almost too much to bear. The man she had trusted, the man she had built a life with, was confessing to being part of the plan to destroy her family. Imagine the heartbreak. Imagine looking across the room at the father of your children and realizing he had been complicit in the slaughter of your blood. But even with Ernest's confession, the trials were far from simple. Witnesses were intimidated. Evidence disappeared. Judges were pressured. Hale's lawyers tried every trick in the book: motions, delays, accusations of bias. At one point, a key witness was found beaten nearly to death. Another was killed before he could testify. The conspiracy's reach was long, and its shadow hung heavy over the courtroom. The Bureau knew that if Hale walked free, the Osage murders would never stop. The message would be clear: wealth made you untouchable. After months of testimony, arguments, and appeals, the jury returned its verdict. William Hale, the so-called king of the Osage Hills, was found guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. His accomplices, including Ernest Burkhart, also faced prison terms. For the Osage, it was a moment of both relief and grief. Justice, at least in part, had been delivered. But no prison sentence could bring back the dozens of lives lost. No guilty verdict could erase the years of fear, betrayal, and sorrow. And even then, justice was not absolute. Hale and others continued to appeal, to maneuver, to manipulate the system. Some sentences were reduced. Some killers never faced trial at all. Through it all, one figure stands out: Molly Burkhart. Against impossible odds, against betrayal by her own husband, against illness and fear, Molly survived. She lived to see her family's killers unmasked. She lived to see the conspiracy dragged into the light. But survival came at a terrible cost. She had lost her sisters, her mother, her trust, and the scars of betrayal would never fully heal. Molly's story is not just one of survival. It is a testament to resilience, to courage, and to the quiet strength of a woman who refused to let her family's murders be forgotten. The trials had ended, but the story of the Osage murders did not, because what happened in Osage County was bigger than William Hale, bigger than Ernest Burkhart, bigger than any single conspiracy. It was a reflection of America itself, its greed, its racism, its willingness to look the other way when indigenous lives were at stake. And the question remains, what lessons did we truly learn? In the final act, we'll uncover the legacy of the Osage murders and why their echoes still haunt us today. The trials were over. William Hale, the so-called King of the Osage Hills, was behind bars. His accomplices had been exposed, and for the first time in years, the Osage Nation could breathe a little easier. But here's the haunting truth. Justice was only partial, because the Osage murders were never just about one man's greed. They were about a system that allowed corruption, racism, and exploitation to thrive. Officially, around 24 Osage people were murdered during the Reign of Terror. But when investigators went back through records, they found signs of far more deaths, hundreds, perhaps, hidden behind false death certificates, silent doctors, and buried secrets. How many Osage were poisoned, shot, or blown up without anyone ever writing their names down? We may never know. The Reign of Terror was not just a series of crimes. It was a massacre spread out over years, disguised as accidents and illnesses. And it robbed a community of not just lives, but trust. For Molly Burkhart, survival was bittersweet. She divorced Ernest. She lived long enough to see her children grow. But she carried the weight of loss with her forever. Her sister's laughter would never return. Her mother's voice was gone. And the man she had once trusted most had betrayed her in the deepest possible way. Molly lived until 1937. Passing away at the age of 50. Some say she died too young. But perhaps after everything she endured, peace finally came as a kind of mercy. The Osage Nation never forgot. Generations later, descendants still speak of the murders with pain in their voices. Families still carry the trauma. And even now, the story feels unfinished because justice never fully arrived. But the Osage also endured. They survived the Reign of Terror. They rebuilt. They continue to fight for their rights, their lands, and their dignity. And in telling this story, their voices echo louder than the silence that once surrounded the murders. The Osage murders forced the nation to face some uncomfortable truths. They revealed how greed could twist neighbors into killers. They showed how racism could blind entire systems of justice. And they marked one of the first major tests of the FBI, a test that would shape the Bureau into the powerful force it is today. But perhaps most importantly, they remind us of a chilling reality. Wealth can make you a target, and when prejudice fuels that greed, the results can be catastrophic. So, what do we take from this story today? We live in a world still shaped by power, money, and exploitation. The Osage murders are not just history. They are a warning, a reminder that when a society values profit over people, when corruption goes unchecked, when prejudice is allowed to fester, tragedies follow. And yet, there is also something else here. Resilience. The Osage Nation endured. Molly endured. Their stories survived the silence, the corruption, the darkness. And now we tell it again, not to sensationalize, but to remember. Because forgetting would mean letting the killers win. And this story must never be forgotten. This was the story of the Osage murders, the story behind Killers of the Flower Moon. If this story shocked you, if it made you think, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Carry it forward. Because history, when hidden, has a way of repeating itself. And sometimes, the only way to honor the dead is to make sure their story keeps living.